support that vision. And for that, I'm going to share with you what we are going to do today. We will now hear from Sira John Kagwe. I hope I'm pronouncing okay. You will apologize me if not. The African Climate Foundation focal person in Nigeria, who will set the context of this discussion. And then we will hear brief summaries of recent analyses that have been prepared by two institutions. First, by Rebecca Shirley, Africa's Research Director at WRI, and Nafi Chinuri, Acting Africa Director of the Natural Resource Governance Institute, NGI. Following those presentations, we have invited responses from a country that is right now negotiating a JETP with international partners, Senegal. And we will have Monsieur Papa Samba Ba, Director of Hydrocarbons at the Ministry of Oil and Energy, that has actually led the development of Senegal's gas master plan. And Monsieur Sekou Sarr, Director of ENDA Energy, a long-standing civil society force for sustainable development well known across West Africa and beyond. And finally, my colleague Rebecca will lead a conversation between the five of them, between our speakers, guided by your questions. Thank you very much to all of you for being here. I will now hand the mic to Rebecca. Oh, to Sira, sorry.
Thank you very much, Carolina. And on the spot. Thank you, Carolina. And thank you to the hosts, the Natural Resource Governance Institute and WRI for inviting ACF to provide opening remarks at this event. Can everyone hear me okay? Okay. So I'll start by saying it's great to see that the debate on African energy has shifted over the past decade. Starting from a discussion on a leapfrog that was the buzzword at the time about a decade ago, to thinking about more nuanced solutions in country-specific manners. And I think the JETP is an example of how country-specific transitions can be helpful in pushing the conversation forward. This is because it puts African energy in the context of the challenges that we face around energy poverty. It also sets it in the context of climate justice, and lastly, in the context of the global energy transition that we're seeing today. And talking about the global energy transition, I would like to challenge us today to really think about the use of the word transition in the African context. Given that Africa is home to about 20% of the world's population today, but it only constitutes 3% of global primary energy consumption. So that's a huge mismatch, and it shows a wide demand gap. To put that in context, Asia as a region constitutes 60% of the world population and consumes 55% of the global primary energy consumption. So when you think about the wide gap, you understand that in the next few decades, as Africa's population expands, the energy that we see today is going to be a marginal part of the energy mix pie. If you envision an energy mix in 2050, for example, whatever the mix is today is going to be a small part, because we're looking at an energy transformation and not just a transition. So I just hope that some of these ideas can help set the tone for the conversation today. And given that the discussion is mainly going to focus on gas, I think as African countries think about their just transition plans and just transition packages, I think it's important to keep all options on the table. But by keeping all options on the table, it doesn't mean walking blindly or just accepting any option that comes. It's about balancing the risks and opportunities that come with different energy resources, gas included. Because gas provides a viable path to provide baseload power, but it also comes with several risks that countries will have to think about as they model their pathways on energy. So I will stop here, and I thank you all for coming, and I wish you all a successful discussion.
Thank you, Sira. And indeed, we need to think about not only the energy transition, but the energy transformation for African societies. And I'm going now to handle the mic.
I've got
You
one.
have your own.
Thank you, Anna Maria. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. It's really a pleasure to be here in, of all pavilions, the Climate Justice Pavilion. My name is Rebecca Shirley. I'm the Director for Research, Data and Innovation at the World Resources Institute Africa, and I'm based in Nairobi, Kenya. And the reason why I'm happy that we're in the Climate Justice Pavilion is because, of course, many of you who are probably here are here because you realize the very direct linkages between energy transitions, and in particular African energy transitions, and climate justice, the delivery of climate justice. And as Anna Maria laid out, that's what we're going to be talking about today, is what some of the mechanisms look like to help deliver African energy transitions, and have an open dialogue about whether they are fit for purpose, what more we can be doing, what are the key risks we have to be aware of, what are the challenges that we have to be aware of, and what might some other options look like as well. So that's what we have this amazing panel for. But what I wanted to do first was just to get us all onto the same page when we're talking about energy transitions, because I know we're coming from many, many different walks of life and many different start points for understanding this conversation. So this debate has become, I think, as we all probably know, it's a little bit tense, right? When we think about the African energy transition debate, of course, as the speaker mentioned, it does revolve around the role of gas, the role of fossil fuels for the continent. And there's some very tricky issues that we have to unpack, including challenges of delivering high amounts of renewables on grid. We have to think about non-electric energy needs. We have to think about industry. We have to think about export revenue earning potential. So when we have these sort of yes-no debates, we're kind of really reducing or simplifying some very complex topics into high-level speaking points. And I'm aware of what I've just said, and I'm going to give you now some high-level speaking points about why we need to nuance out that conversation. So the first off, if I could have my slides, please. I'm going to see if I can. There we go. The first off, well, let me start here, and I'm going to try and keep this brief. The first is that when we're asking the questions about what are the best energy transition pathways for the continent, we have to kind of break that question down a bit. Because we mean a couple of things there. We mean, what are the best ways to build out domestic grids across the continent? That's question one. Where best there means a couple of things. We also mean, what are the best ways to deliver non-electrified energy needs, like heat and feedstock needs that we need energy for? So that's question two. And then there's a third question about, well, what do we do about energy exports? What's the best way for Africa to leverage its current resources for export earning potential? So there are three questions that we have to kind of ask, and the sum of answers across those three give you a sense of what transitions pathways might look like, and you'll see where the justice link is going to come in just a second. So if we take that first question about what are the best ways to build out domestic grids for African countries, we've all seen the slides before that show us that high variable renewable energy pathways are possible. And this is not just an Africa conversation, right? Globally, we know that high variable renewable energy systems are very, very possible. We wouldn't have said that 10 years ago or 15 years ago, but the technology has really changed, especially around what allows us to balance a system, make sure that at any point in time the system is in play, the system is in check. And we're able to do that leveraging geographic diversity of energy resources. So the idea of baseload is kind of what I like to say, it's sort of an outdated concept. The issue really now is flexibility, and there's lots of fantastic work going on that has allowed us to realize that we can get up to 85%. The current range I hear is something between 70 to 85%. We can definitely do that with variable renewables, meaning solar and wind and so on. And then you need, of course, you might need resources to help you with balancing the rest, maybe something about 10 to 15%. And it will, whether you need gas to that will be dependent on what other resources you have available, hydro, et cetera, et cetera. But the point is that high variable renewable energy systems are, of course, very, very possible. And we know that many countries, the EU and its countries, the UK and the US, are all aiming for net zero grids by 2035. And that also pertains to Africa. In fact, even more so, because we don't have those big seasonal swings that take us from winter into summer that mean a lot of things for the grid. We have a fairly even, we don't need a heavy heating resource and so on. So even more so for the continent. And we've all seen these slides that show us, yeah, and solar is $1 a watt, right? So simple, easy, let's just go solar on the continent. But one of the things that some of those models tend to forget is that although at the levelized cost, using a levelized cost metric, solar and wind would theoretically be cheaper, there's a couple of other hidden costs that we bear the brunt of in Africa that we have to take into consideration. So this brings us to the cost of capital. And the cost of capital actually is quite high across the continent. And when you layer those into the levelized cost of technologies, it can really change the dynamic. And so one of the things that we have to work on is, well, how do we reduce those costs of capital? How do we make it easier to lend and to do commercial transactions on the continent so that we are able to leverage that theoretical potential that renewables have for the continent. And I just wanted to put that in graphic form. Here you have, this is a graph of weighted average cost of capital across the continent. And you can see that where the black dots, the Africa countries are the black dots, and you can see that I've put that, that sort of peachy shape over the dots, where you can see that we're high above what is the assumed weighted average cost of capital in our IEA studies. We've all read the Africa Energy Outlooks that show us that renewables are the cheaper way to go, and much above the IRENA assumptions on weighted average cost of capital. So our models are possibly being a little bit too optimistic about these costs, and we really need to do a lot of work as a community to redress this issue so that renewables actually are the cheaper way to go, and that we can unlock the opportunity for those variable renewable energy systems that I talked about. The second thing that we oftentimes forget in the modeling is that in addition to our generation costs are, of course, our grid costs. And this is another area where we tend to underemphasize the need. Of course, our grids today look roughly the same that they looked about 20 to 40 years ago across the continent. So we have a lot of work to do on getting grids ready to absorb that level of renewable energy generation on the grid once we've solved those cost of technology issues. But the challenge is that we have very little investment today going into our grids. What we would actually need globally, an average of about $0.6 billion of grid investments are required for every $1 billion of generation. But on the continent, because we're starting from such a low base, our average is about 1.5 billion of grid investment is needed for every billion of generation. And we're hitting almost zero of that. I believe AFDB is in the crowd and can tell us a little bit more about that as well. So we really need some of these more mundane issues to be kind of talked about more, right? Like if we really want to do a variable renewable energy system across the continent that is as ambitious as possible, we have to start talking about some of these quieter, more mundane issues. The second thing that I want to say is that once we've answered that question about what are the best ways to build out our domestic grids, and we've realized, right, we need to get investment into ancillary services and grid, and we need to really work on the cost of capital to make these technologies truly cost effective. The next set of questions, as I mentioned at the top, is, well, what about those things that can't be electrified or that aren't easily electrified right now? So we're talking about steel, we're talking about ammonia for fertilizer, we're talking about cement, we're talking about cooking, we're talking about transportation. These are not sectors that are very easily electrified, although we know we're going to be in about a 60% electrified world in the future. There's about 40% of our energy needs that we have to figure out what are we going to do. So what the best available research is showing us is that there are a slew of viable alternatives today that are becoming more and more commercial day by day that might present the alternatives for us in some of these key spaces. So some of you might have heard, and there's a number of pavilions around the COP that are focused on green hydrogen, green steel, green cement. Because I'm very short on time, I'm not going to get too much into that. But these are some of the key alternatives that we really need to be doing more research into to understand what their opportunity is for the continent, especially given our high renewables base. There are some that are a little bit harder, like cooking. We think LPG might be the way to go on cooking in the foreseeable future till we're able to get to a more electrified base, and also transportation. There's going to be a vehicle stock turnover as the EU, as Japan, as the US move towards a fully electric stock. Those are eventually going to come this way through the secondary vehicle, second-hand vehicle ownership market. So there may be some lag time there for the continent, even as we're pushing on electric mobility policies. So there may be some areas where we have to be understanding and sort of be cognizant of the practical limits of the technology, but we really need to be pushing much harder on those alternative spaces for steel, for cement, for fertilizer, that are the basis of what we mean by industrialization for the continent. And actually what happens is when you think about the best possible case scenarios, if we were really to think about alternatives for steel, for cement, for LPG, for cooking, and so on, what we realize is that we're talking about maybe 100 to 150 BCM per year for the continent peak, which is a very small amount of gas relative to what the rest of the world is using. In Europe, in European Union, we're talking about 400 BCM per year today. What this means for us is that the bigger challenge, the bigger thing that we need to be focusing our attention on is the third question, which is export. Because if there is any real opportunity for the continent in developing these resources, it's probably going to be here in the export space. And the question of, well, how much opportunity is there is really dependent on these lines. So these lines are showing us what worldwide demand forecasted for natural gas looks like between now and I believe I have 2050 here on this slide, yeah. So I have oil on this side and I have gas on this side. Let's focus on gas. So the purple, the orange, and the blue lines are showing us what different net zero estimates or net zero projections look like. And you can see they all, of course, drop off fairly steeply until we're at about less than 2 million BCM per year for the entire globe. So that sounds really good, right? If we could see that steep drop off, and if you think that steep drop off is going to happen, then it obviously means the economics are not going to work out to begin pursuing these resources. But the green line is important too, because that's announced pledges. That's what's actually announced. And as you can see, that line is not dropping off. And so the market signals are suggesting something very different than what we all know needs to be true if we're really going to get aligned with our 1.5 degrees Celsius targets. So this is something that we also have to address, is the market signals, the international market signals on both the supply and the demand side of gas resources, and similarly for oil. Interestingly, for the continent, either way, even if we were to stay along, even if we were to assume this green line, this sad green line is where we were going to stay for the future, and we weren't somehow going to be more ambitious and get ourselves down to 1.5, what that means for the continent is actually still not very good. Here I have a supply cost curve. So this shows for volumes of supply on the x-axis here, and for different price points on the y-axis here, what it would cost to produce that much volume in the given country. And the country, so if you can just go like this a little bit so people can see, you can see there's colors here. These are our regions. Thank you. So Africa, we're the yellow bar over there. And what you can see is if we stick to those announced pledges, that green line that I showed you before, where we're still consuming 80 billion cubic meters of gas by 2040, there's a lot cheaper gas across the globe that could be built out. We're all the way on the right-hand side of this graph. And so it wouldn't make economic sense. And especially if we are able to be ambitious enough to get ourselves to these net zero targets, where we're maybe at 20 to 30 BCM per year, then it really doesn't make sense from an economic point of view. And so these are some of the conversations that we need to start having is, well, from an economics point of view, even if we often hear that there's a justice argument for our countries to be able to build out these resources, there's an economic argument why that might not be the right way to go. And while this is a declining opportunity, there might be an increasing, an expanding opportunity in other areas like green hydrogen, like green minerals that the continent could really look at. But we need far more research and at a country by country level to really think through what the opportunities are. So I just wanted to give us that high-level overview before we dive into the panel of what some of the complexities look like when we talk about transitions. It's not as simple as A or B. We have to have some flexibility. We have to have some leniency, but we also have to be as ambitious as possible. So with that, I wanted to just pass it over back to Anna, pass it to Nafi, where we're going to hear what some NRGI research is looking like on this exact issue of gas, and then come back to our panel. Thanks, guys.
Thank you very much, Rebecca. And so what I'm going to do is to share some of our preliminary findings from some analysis that we are doing around how JETP partnerships could support just transition in Africa. So just a bit of context that last year, the whole world got very excited when the political declaration for South Africa was signed. And sometime this year, we heard about Senegal also discussing negotiation with Germany and France. And so we know that Senegal is not, coal dependent or fossil fuel dependent, but we know also that this year, Senegal is going to be a new producer of gas. And so these kind of discussions and negotiation, it's raising a lot of interest in Africa, especially countries that are gas producers. And so we thought that it's important for us to look at the data and some of the analysis to begin to use it to inform discussions and negotiations around JET partnership to ensure that it is fairer and supports the economies of these countries. And so we have also heard from, with this background and what we have heard from what Rebecca has presented, we know that gas actually is not the solution, cannot provide economic solution to Africa's demand for energy security, right? It's not going to address our issues. So we sought to ask two questions that inform our analysis. I don't know whether my presentation is okay. So what we try to do at NRGI is, first of all, ask the two questions, which is one, how could these partnerships achieve a fair and balanced climate and development goals? The second one is, how could they support faster, fairer, and scale up of renewable energy system? And mind you, renewable energy system is what we are talking about. But before I go into discussing, sharing some of the summaries from our preliminary work, I would like to go over a few issues with you, which is, if you look at this graph, you would see that there are countries that are actually big oil and gas producers, right? And if you look at the graph here, what is telling us that they have the capacity to go through the transition. And you can see that 33 of these countries actually have the capacity to go through the transition without any problems. And a few of them, right, that especially are in Global South, do not have the capacity to go through the transition. And so it's important that if we are going to talk about a just transition, we need these guys that are the big producers to support the small producers to go through the transition. What this graph is also telling us is that out of the 33 countries that are the big producers of oil and gas, they emit about 50, they produce about 51% of the gas in the world. And the rest of the world produce just 44%. And in Africa, you see that just 5% is coming out of Africa. And this really means that if these guys here, of the 33%, really want to support a just transition, they have the money, the finances to do that. And so the starting point of any conversation around just transition should not be around moving away from gas, but actually how can we support your economy to transition in a way that will not continue to pollute the environment. That should be the starting point, and not be, we should not start from a point where you are emitting, because if you look at what this graph is saying, very little, just 5% is coming from Africa. And so we need to be very mindful of the fact that these guys haven't actually polluted the world, and they don't have the capacity compared to the graph that we saw earlier on. They don't have the capacity and they don't have the resources because they don't produce much. They haven't actually generated revenue from it, and they need to be supported to go through the transition. And so with that, I would look at some of the, where did I put that? I would now share some of the initial findings that is coming out of, and I say these are preliminary findings. They are not recommendations that we have. What we are seeking to do is to share these with you and hear your feedback and use the feedback to finalize our work. So first of all, from everything that we have heard, and also from Rebecca's presentation, what we are saying that we, for Africa, so we made some recommendation for countries to actually pay attention to. We made recommendations also for international partners who are coming into this negotiation, that the starting point really should be about supporting the economies of these countries, right? And the starting point should not be about how do we get you to transition fast and quicker, because when we do that, we are going to destroy the economies of these countries. So the other recommendation, what the analysis that, the findings from the analysis that we have done is telling us that African countries that are seeking to use gas to go into partnership should come to the table and be more transparent about how much gas they have, right? And so you need to let your partners know how much gas you have. Partners also need to let African countries know how much money they are going to invest into the sector and over what period. Because in that way, it helps the countries to plan around the transition period, the transition process. The other issue that we actually like to flag for partners is that it's important for partners to also be transparent about the negotiation, and that when they come to the table, they should be ready to take up, because they have the capacity and they have the revenue, they should be ready to take up some of the risk areas around supporting gas development, particularly around infrastructure. These are risky areas. How do we get finances to support these? We need to, partners also need to come to the table willingly to absorb some of these shocks. In terms of, we also have made, proposed some principles that can guide discussions around this. So for example, we need to develop more effective framework that can guide negotiations between countries and international parties. I would stop here, mindful that we have just 10 minutes left, and hear feedback from you, and we will use, and as I said, and I want to establish that these are preliminary findings. These are not recommendations that we are making out. It's still a working paper and a discussion, and we want to hear feedback from all of you to use this to shape the paper that NRGI is developing to guide how these partnership arrangements are made and to strengthen the ability and capacity of countries that go into these negotiations. Thank you very much.
You want to stay there? You want to come? You want to come back here? All right. Do a swapperoo. Okay. Thank you. Right. So now we're moving into the. That was really more to give you guys a bit of a, make sure that we're all on the same page in this conversation. And to our discussants, so we've laid out together between NRGI and WRI, we've laid out some of the complexities of what just energy transitions involve. We talked about the cost of capital, the very difficult challenges of actually financing renewables and the need for longer term low cost financing. We talked about need for support for grid. We talked about non-electric energy sectors and what we do there. We talked about alternatives for export revenue earnings. We talked about international market signals and what those mean in Africa. And then Nafi just did this fantastic talk about what some principles for then structuring up just energy transitions might look like for the continent. So I want to come to you both, Papa Sambaba, perhaps I'll come to you first to just give some early reflections and also to give your thoughts on what just energy transitions plans and pledges really must be considering in the context of Africa, which is, as we've seen from this presentation, fairly unique relative to other countries that might be, and regions that might be developing transition plans.
Thank you very much, Rebecca, and congratulations to our two ladies in the panel. So I think they set up very clearly the subject and really with very quantified data and an approach I think that could help really to progress in this discussion. It is important that we rely on science and in economic science, and I really love the way it was presented by both of you. To us in Senegal, we discuss about, people are talking about this just energy transition partnership for a country like Senegal. Senegal is very committed to in this just energy transition. And we heard a lot this past month about advocacy around natural gas as the right of Senegal to produce its natural resources in order to both finance, how to say, develop its economy, but also get enough energy to have energy access in for the population. So this said, we think that while we discuss about energy transition in Senegal and in Africa, we should really keep all the options on the table. That means being less dogmatic, choosing the right option to fulfill the needs in terms of energy, the need in terms of economic development, both for the short term, but also for the medium and long term. And just to squeeze on that, I think in your presentation also, on the market point of view, it should be important also to see, to have a more, how to say, aggregated vision on the energy market on natural gas. I think perhaps with Western countries, Western area should have the demand decreasing, and they are the main importer of that. But Africa need also, as I say, to develop its economy, and this will come with industrialization. This will come also with some transformation industries that will need such kind of resources, not only natural gas. Let's not focus and be dogmatic on natural gas. For transforming the minerals, we'll need energy, hot energy. So hydrogen, yes, but let's be realistic. It is not something that is ready right now to go to that. So we need also to take the point in a holistic view, but not only oriented on the Western market, on the Western point of view. The Western is responsible of the major emission right now. They need to decrease hardly the share, and Africa need really to push on that. I will finish on one point, on the impact of emission of Africa gas sector. That is, I think, well known, and studies was made very clearly by the International Energy Agency, showing that even if Africa develops its own gas resources, it will increase its contribution to the global greenhouse gas from 3% to 3.4. It is 0.4. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that. I think you made really good points about the need for the international community to really be responsible for those market signals and what they're saying to the continent. So really liked that point. Sekou Sarr, I want to come to you now because, of course, Senegal is also a renewable energy leader. We can't forget that. It is a renewable energy leader. And I want to get your thoughts from ENDA's point of view, one of the leaders in the sector, about what, well, first of all, your reflections on the Just Energy Transitions conversation that's happening right now in Senegal and how you feel that the Just Energy Transitions framework might be of benefit to the country.
Thank you so much. I would like to congratulate you and your, this lady, Nafissatou, on this great presentation. And I think we have learned so much on this presentation in terms of scientist aspect. But I think in the context of Senegal, like what Monsieur Ba has said, we are in Senegal have now petrol and gas, and we are starting the discussion about the energy transition. And recently, from our side, we have organized a multi-actors policy dialogue to get what are the perception of all the category of actors in terms of just energy transition. And therefore, a partnership for just energy transition must address following issue. The first one is the sovereignty to reduce the bill, but also to reduce the risk of inflation. Because as we know now, referring to the situation between Europe in terms of difficulty in supply difficulty on gas, something like we see what we need actually is not to talk about energy security. For me, energy security is not sufficient now. If we look at the crisis of oil and gas that Europeans are facing now. And I think we need to rethinking this kind of concept in terms of energy security. What we need to focus on is energy sovereignty. Because people, a country who has renewable energy like solar, like wind, like hydro, and oil and gas, this country can talk about energy sovereignty. And it is one of the aspects coming from the policy dialogue. The next aspect is universal access of energy. And it is a huge dimension for development. Because if you look at the African context, 600 million people have not access to electricity. And I think if you talk about energy transition, we need both technology to look at how we can bring all this technology and selected referring to the best trajectory, you can select how we can optimize the combination of all this technology. And it is something raised during the policy dialogue with actors. The third one will be low carbon footprint and resilience. And there are a strong link with the access to energy. It is a real link. But what we need, and I would like to share some example at this issue. We are trying in Senegal to work in a long-term strategy. In a long-term strategy and low carbon strategy and resilience. We are starting this process with the government of Senegal to have the long-term vision in terms of energy access. And referring to that, we have selected 4 main transitions. The first one is the energy transition. The second one is urban transition in terms of mobility. The third one is in the agricultural sector. And the fourth one will be on the industrialization aspect. It is the 4th transition we have selected to give the possibility to the country to elaborate some trajectory and have the possibility to select what will be the best trajectory in terms of energy transition. It is my first intervention. It is some issues I would like to highlight it. Thank you so much.
That was excellent, and I liked how Senegal is taking a long-term view and seeing energy as interconnected to urban, agricultural, and industrial transition. So that makes a lot of sense. I want to ask another 2 questions to each of you, our discussants, and then I'm going to turn it over to the... So our session is only 45 minutes? Oh, we thought we had an hour. It turns out we have only 45 minutes. Oh, my. Oh, well, we've gotten through quite a bit of material. We have 2 minutes. Thank you for that. Okay, so with our 2 minutes, let's split it up half and half. Give you each another second to speak. If you could, in 60 seconds, your thoughts on what are some of the risks we might need to be wary of as we're designing just energy transition pledges for African countries?
I think in terms of risk, if we have to identify, it should be commitment need to be, fair. Africa is not responsible of these emissions and the climate change. And I think we should refer to the Article 2 of Paris Agreement. The fairness of this JP is at the heart of the risk, I think. If it is not fair, if the commitment is not respected, it will not work for the continent. So the continent needs really to have enough guarantee and enough commitment from the developed countries in order to have the all the investment needed, all the technology access, all the transfer of skills also needed in order to have all aspects needed for the clean energy transition inside Africa, or at least not to controlled by outside. This is and it will join the sovereignty. It is about sovereignty. Africa need to keep on its way as sovereign continent, not be locked in this energy transition.
Fairness and sovereignty, I appreciate that. And Sekou, the last word will be yours. Your thoughts on how African governments could strengthen their positions as we negotiate just energy transitions pledges for the continent. Thank you.
From my side, I think Africa need to have a same voice on this in the energy transition. It will be so difficult because the contexts are very different. But I think we need to have this kind of a concertation to get a position on what we want for Africa now. Because I think we need, referring to the possibility that the opportunity in terms of energy in Africa, we need to use this energy for our industrialization, for the industrialization process. I think it will be an orientation, and the risk is will depend if policymakers do not have this agreement between them to be sure that they can push the process and guarantee also the ownership of this kind of process, not only from outside of Africa. The Africa can lead this kind of process because Africa has the opportunity to supply energy for several countries. It is our position.
Thank you for that, Sekou. Unfortunately, we do have to wrap now. Thank you so much for joining us and staying with us. We hope that this was a useful discussion for those of you in the audience to understand when we're talking about energy transitions, what are the challenges, what are the complexities, and also to hear live from a country that is actually actively working through its own just energy transition strategy and partnership. Thank you again for your time, and if you'd like to connect with us, I think our speakers will now have 15 minutes that they can hang around and chat with you all. So we will close the session here. Thank you.